everybody. Hello. Welcome back to The Remnant. Welcome back to The Remnant Christian book reading. Welcome back to The Remnant Christian book reading. We are going to be reading Eli. We're on chapter 8. Chapter 8. Can you believe that already? Chapter 8. Well, after the last video, if you would have seen it, it was a marathon of 3 chapters, so it's a good boost to get closer to finishing the book. We're almost there. We're about midway through. You can kind of see the book there. We're on this side, so we're about midway through. It's gonna get really good, really fast. So put on your seatbelts, get ready, grab your popcorn, your chips, get comfortable. Let's get ready, because this book is gonna get good really fast. Chapter 8 of Eli. McFarland, do I look that stupid? Do I have to answer that? The balding news reporter from EBN fired back. It was supposed to be in jest, but the way the overweight man was huffing and puffing as they moved up the terraced hillside, it looked like he was having anything but fun. Not that Conrad blamed him. After all, the only way he'd agreed to talk with McFarland was by pressing him into service alongside Keith and himself as they handed out food to the crowd. The big man had reluctantly joined them less than 5 minutes ago, and the poor guy was already working up a sweat in the hot Oklahoma sun. Conrad knew what galled him helping out like this, which was probably why he insisted he do it. Still, with this large of a crowd, they needed all the help they could get. What had started out as a scheduled event at the Woodward Memorial Park in Tulsa this Saturday had turned into an all-day marathon. Although the group had rented the bandstand from 9 to 12, the officials and assigned police were so captivated by what they saw and heard that they allowed Eli to continue. The crowd was equally caught up, and noontime came and went with most not even caring that they'd missed lunch. Eli was in great form, sharing one story after another, explaining how absolutely holy God expected his children to be, yet how loving and forgiving he was if they failed. And, despite the crowd's size, Eli remained as intimate as if it were a handful of his closest friends. More often than not, he was off the stage with the park department's wireless mic, casually strolling through the crowd, occasionally chatting with individuals, sometimes healing them. But by 3 o'clock, Jake and Robert, alongside with Scott and Brent, had pulled Eli into the backstage shade and suggested he call it quits. If not for himself, then at least for the crowd. "The folks haven't eaten since morning," Robert insisted, handing Eli a styrofoam glass with ice water. "Lots of them got kids. They must be starved." "I know I am," grumbled Jake, as he slumped onto the wooden steps leading to the stage. He popped open another of the dozen Diet Cokes he consumed daily and began to guzzle. Excuse me. Eli nodded, slowly thinking it over. He grabbed the towel Maggie had brought him for her. Excuse me, I am so sorry. Eli nodded, slowly thinking it over. He grabbed the towel Maggie had brought from her camper and wiped off his sweating face. Then he scooped ice out of his cup, lowered his head, and pressed it against the back of his neck. The summer heat was taking a lot out of him, but he never complained. Not as long as there was a need. Not as long as people were willing to listen. "All right," Eli finally answered, his voice hoarse from the lengthening day. "Why don't you guys go ahead and feed them?" "With what?" Scott asked. "All we've got are a couple burgers and a side of fries some kid brought you." Eli raised his head and gave his face another wipe while catching the stray ice water dribbling down his chest. Then give that to them. Right, Brent scoffs. We've got how many thousands of people out here, and you want us to feed them with 2 burgers and a side of fries? Give it a shot, Eli said as he stepped over Jake to head back on stage. Then with that infectious twinkle he called over his shoulder, "You might be surprised." That had been 45 minutes ago, and now Conrad and the guys were definitely surprised. So far they'd fed about half the crowd with more hamburgers and fries than they could count. No one had bought more. No one had donated more. Instead, Scott had simply poured the contents of the kids' bag onto the grocery sack Suzanne had provided until her sack literally overflowed with wrapped hamburgers and loose fries. More sacks and bags were scrounged up. They, too, were filled to the brim. And still, it didn't stop. When the sacks were distributed to Eli's followers and they moved through the crowd passing out the burgers and fries, their sacks never seemed to empty either. All Conrad and the others had to do was reach into their bags and pull out one burger after another, or pour out one helping of fries after another. Now, Conrad was no math whiz, but he knew this defied logic by any standard. Of course, McFarland, who had just joined the serving committee, hadn't a clue as to what was happening. But he would. "Look, we just need a link to him," the big man gasped as he trudged up the grassy hillside passing out the food. "An unofficial diplomatic channel." "And the reason it has to be unofficial?" Keith asked. "You don't need me to tell you that." "Try us," Conrad said. McFarland lowered his voice, making sure those in the crowd were not following the conversation. "Let's just say it would be a great source of embarrassment if the public knew he and my boss were talking." "But he hasn't withdrawn his invitation to the City of God, has he?" Conrad asked. "Of course not. That would be a breach of Southern hospitality." "Of course," Conrad sighed. "But you wouldn't be opposed if Eli backed out." "Not in the slightest. But of course he won't." "Not in the slightest." "Well," McFarland sighed heavily, motioning to his bag, "I'm about out." He wiped the sweat from his face. "Maybe we can go somewhere place a little cooler to talk." "Here," Conrad said, reaching over and dumping a sack of burgers into McFarland's until it was full. McFarland looked on, astonished. "Where'd you get all those?" Conrad smiled and continued the conversation. "What else do you want from me, besides being this liaison?" "Isn't that obvious?" McFarland asked. "With you, always." McFarland tried to chuckle, though it came out more of a wheezing cough. Again he lowered his voice. "Look, you know how the religious community has always been looking for the Messiah. How our country's been going down the drain, and how we need someone to kick a little sinner's hiney to get this nation back on track with God." "And you think Eli might be the one?" Keith asked. Conrad threw a glance at his ambitious young partner. No doubt the kid felt cocky, thinking he was on equal footing with such seasoned pros. "That's just it," McFarland answered. "We don't know." Conrad replied, "After his arrest at Leon's party, the lawsuits you've slapped on him, the disinformation you're spreading through the media and internet, sounds to me like your boss has more than made up his mind." "He just doesn't fit the prophecies, that's all." "What do you mean?" "There are hundreds of prophecies in the Bible that talk of a man who will rally the people of God, a great leader who will strengthen things or straighten things out and get people to start doing things God's way." "Someone like Dr. Thomas J. Kirsten?" McFarland gave him a look. "That's always a possibility." Conrad shook his head, quietly musing. McFarland continued, "My point is, your boy here is not fulfilling any of those prophecies. He's not fitting the profile." Except for the miracles, the healings, and raising people from the dead, Conrad said. He couldn't resist the temptation of pouring more burgers into McFarlane's bag to underscore the point. Yes, McFarlane said, numbly watching the burgers pour in, except for the miracles. And you want us to... It took him a moment for McFarlane to recover. Help us! Help us force him to play his hand. I mean, if he's the guy we're all waiting for, Dr. Kirsten will be the first to admit that he's been wrong. I bet. He would. Not only that, but he'd be the first to pour or to put his sizable muscle behind him. Think what that could do for Eli, for his cause. Who knows? With Dr. Kirsten's political clout, we might even be able to get your boy into office somewhere. And if he's not the one? Keith asked. For a moment, McFarlane did not answer. Conrad repeated the question. And if he's not the one you're waiting for? Then he needs to be stopped before he leads any more people astray. I see. We just want him to be straight with us, that's all. One minute he says he's God's son, then a good teacher, then he performs miracles, then he doesn't. Either this man is the Messiah we've been waiting for, or he isn't. It's as simple as that. We just need to know the truth. Help us find out the truth. Connie, you've been a proponent of truth all your life. It's your greatest strength. Conrad said nothing. He was grateful that Keith decided to follow his example. For the good of those people, for the good of the country, help us find the truth. It was an obvious ploy that Conrad saw through immediately. But still, now that Eli had polarized everyone anyway, now that people either loved him or hated him, what would be so terribly wrong with encouraging him to take the next step, to go public with the identity that many suspected of him anyway? And if, as McFarlane suggested, they could get the religious establishment behind him, well, his impact upon the country would be enormous. Hadn't that been Eli's purpose all along? Granted, it was just a thought, a cleverly planted one whose source he didn't entirely trust. But it was a thought. The phone rang as Julia opened the front door to the house. She pulled the key from the lock and fumbled for the hall switch, clicking both it and the porch light on at the same time. The screen door slammed behind her, and she elbowed the front door shut. Straight ahead lay the paneled hallway leading to her father's office. To her right was the arched entrance into the living room. She chose the arched entrance. The phone rang a second time. She dumped her suit bag into a chair already covered in books and magazines. She reached over to the end table and snapped on the lamp. The place looked no better in the light. Magazines, newspapers, and stacks of videotapes lay on the floor in front of a big screen TV. It's not that her father was a slob, it's just that he was always working. And now that he had the house to himself, his workspace had naturally invaded his living space. Then there was the stale smell of cigars. He was never much of a smoker, but from time to time he pretended to be. The phone rang a third time. She ignored it as she crossed through the dining room, snapping on more lights, seeing more books and papers piled on the old cherry table. She headed for the kitchen as much out of hunger as habit, a habit that started in elementary school and continued into later when she visited from college. She arrived and turned on the light. Another table, another pile of papers. Over at the sink rose a mound of dirty dishes, mostly coffee mugs, precariously balanced. To the right, near the refrigerator, was a garbage bag overflowing with used microwave food cartons and containers. The phone had made its fourth and final ring before the answering machine kicked in. It was her father's voice, direct and to the point. "Hi, leave a message at the tone, thanks." Beep. Then another voice followed. "Hi, Julia. This is Mom. If you're there, will you pick up?" What on earth? How did she know she'd be here? "Julia?" Julia dashed out of the kitchen and back into the living room. She brushed the papers off the end table, but the phone wasn't there. "I don't know if you'll get this or not, but Ken said he told you I'd be out in the morning." She zeroed in on the voice. It came from the stacks of books piled in front of the fireplace. "My plane's boarding now. I think it's the same flight you were on last night." She raced to the stacks, searching for the machine, for anything plastic amidst the pile of paper. "It's a terrible decision you're having to make, and I know you can handle it by yourself, and you probably want me to keep my nose out of it, but I just don't think you should be there alone." "Mom?" She pushed the books aside, digging more frantically until she spotted the answering machine. The phone had to be nearby. She grabbed the line and physically followed it through the books. "Anyway, I guess it was stupid thinking you'd be there. I also left word at the hospital. One way or another, I'll see you soon, sweetheart." No, that line led to the wall jack. She had to follow the other one, the one to the phone. "Mom!" Backtracking to the answering machine, she dropped to her knees. "I love you, Jules. I'll be praying." There it was, on the hearth. She lunged for the receiver and scooped it up. "Bye-bye." "Mom!" She shouted into the receiver. There was a click. "Mom! Are you there? Mom!" Nothing. Just silence. And then the dial tone. "Mom." Her voice wearily faded. She was so drained, so exhausted, and very so much alone. She closed her eyes. Every inch of her head throbbed. She lowered it, letting out a long, slow sigh. Eventually the phone began to beep, a reminder to hang up. She reached over and replaced the receiver. There, still on her knees amidst the pile of books, she thought how easy it would be to stretch out, just to use a book or two for a pillow and catch a little sleep right there, right now. But of course she wouldn't. That wasn't her style. Julia Davis Preston was stronger than that. She had to be. So with another heavy sigh, she rose to her feet and once again did what she had to do. The park officials shut the meeting down a little before 8. Just as well, there's no telling how long Eli would have gone on if they hadn't. With so many people in need of healing and teaching and explanations regarding the kingdoms of heaven, he would have stayed there all night. On 3 separate occasions, Conrad and the guys had tried to convince him to quit. But his argument was always the same. "These are the people I've come to help, and my time is so short." Yet, as dusk approached, it was obvious that even the great Eli Shepherd was reaching his limit. By 5 o'clock his voice was going. By 7 o'clock it was barely above a whisper. And still he was reluctant to stop. And still the crowd was reluctant to leave. "There is so much pain here," he croaked to the guys. "So much need." Conrad was pleased that McFarland had chosen to stay. He was pleased for Eli's sake. He was pleased for McFarland's sake. And he was pleased for his own. Truth be told, he enjoyed watching Eli's logic scramble McFarland's religious self-righteousness. There were times the man listened with his mouth agape, times he nearly scoffed out loud, and times he could only shake his head in wonder. It was amusing, to say the least. What was not amusing was the way McFarland, after the crowd had been dismissed and was heading home, suddenly produced a tape recorder and confronted Eli. Conrad, Jake, and Will had been trying to get him through the mass of people to Maggie's camper, parked backstage when McFarland suddenly appeared, calling and pushing his way toward the front. "Eli! Eli! Gerald McFarland from EBN News! Eli!" If Eli heard, he did not respond. Instead, he turned and suddenly came to a stop. "Who touched me?" He croaked. Or, excuse me, he croaked it. I need to fix that. "Who touched me?" He croaked. Conrad exchanged glances with Jake and Will. What was he talking about? "Somebody touched me." Eli's voice cracked. Who was it?" "Eli." Jake leaned closer. "We've got a whole crowd pushing in here. What do you mean, who touched you?" Eli tried to speak louder, his ruined voice croaking and skipping. "Somebody touched me. I felt power leave. Where are you?" The small crowd murmured, glancing at one another. McFarland took advantage of the moment to try again. "Eli, Gerald McFarland from EBN News." Oh no, the pages are stuck together. Hold on. Eli held out his hand, motioning for silence. "It's important that you tell me," he tried to shout. He waited, continuing to search the crowd. "It's important for you." Jake coughed slightly. "Eli, I don't think he'll..." "Shh," Eli said. "Give her time." The crowd grew restless. Now there was only the sound of crickets in the nearby highway. Nearly a half-minute passed before the slight disturbance began toward the back. People stepped aside, making room for someone to pass. Finally, an embarrassed woman in shorts and frizzy red hair came into view. She was in her late 20s, perspiring heavily and very, very frightened. But she continued forward. As she approached, her gaze dropped to the ground, and when she arrived, she was breathing so hard she could not speak. "It's you," Eli croaked. She looked up, but only for a moment. I've... Her voice trembled as she looked back down. She swallowed and tried again, this time in a low whisper. "I've had this problem for years." "Go on," Eli said. She swallowed again. "They keep operating and stuff, but nobody is able to fix it." Eli nodded but remained silent, forcing her to continue. She stared at the ground, struggling with each phrase. "I knew if I could just touch you, or your clothing, I knew I'd get well." "And?" Eli's erect voice whispered back. Finally she looked up, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I am," she blurted. "I can feel it. I'm completely well." At last, Eli broke into a grin. He reached out to embrace her, and she threw herself into his arms. They remained hugging like that for a long moment. When they finally separated, Eli's face was as wet as her own. "Thank you," she whispered fiercely. "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." He tried to answer, though it was growing harder for him to talk. "Your faith," he finally croaked. That's what has made you well." She hugged him again. Then, abruptly turning, she started back toward the crowd. Although she was still embarrassed, she did not look back at the ground. Instead, she kept her head held up, beaming. Eli watched after her, also grinning, until he was again interrupted by McFarland. Eli, Dr. Kirsten has a question for you." Conrad tensed as he saw Eli slowly turn toward him. "Sir, Dr. Kirsten has a question." "You're Connie's friend," Eli said. Yes, sir." "Helped us." His voice quit and he tried again. "Helped us to serve lunch." "Well, yes, a little, that's right." "Did you get anything out of my talk?" "Me?" McFarland asked, caught off guard. Eli nodded. "What do you think?" "What do I think?" That's when Conrad moved in. "Come on, Eli. You can talk another time. No, Eli croaked quietly. I'd like to hear what your friend thinks. The crowd focused their attention on McFarland. Well, as far as the teaching you mean? Eli nodded. Well, he cleared his throat. It makes for some very interesting theory. I mean, this business of giving to receive, of servants becoming leaders, of praying for your enemies, but that's all it is, just theory, right? Why do you say that? Why? Why? Well, let's face it. No one can possibly live by those standards. On their own, no. But with God's power, absolutely. In fact, God expects us to. Eli's voice was again giving out, but he pushed himself. Listen to me carefully, Gerald McFarland. My father expects you to be holy just as he is holy. McFarland blinked, trying to gather his wits. Finally, he responded. And yet you pick followers who... He motioned across the crowd toward Will, then Leon. No offense, but who are at the bottom of the moral and social food chain? Hey! Leon countered. Yes, Eli quietly nodded. But the Will Pattons and Leon Brewsters of the world, they know they need my help. They know they need God's forgiveness. Whereas men like you and Dr. Kirsten, you are sadly oblivious to that fact. Men like Dr. Kirsten are worth 100 Leon Brewsters. Eli smiled sadly, then quietly answered. To whom? McFarland's anger continued to rise. Listen! You can't have it both ways. You can't talk about God's holiness and perfection one minute, then his love and forgiveness the next. Why not? McFarland's frustration grew. Because it's impossible. That's why. Eli was about to respond when McFarland wasn't through. That's exactly what I mean about the theory versus reality. You can't have it both ways. Holiness and forgiveness. Justice and mercy. In theory, you can say anything you want. But when it comes down to practical day-to-day living, the two are incompatible. Why? Conrad watched uneasily as McFarland's wheels turned. Over the years, he'd seen this man spin and weave traps for many a prey. He was quite good at it, and this would be no exception. Take Ellen Perkins, McFarland finally said. The little girl they're getting ready to execute in Texas for the murder of her boyfriend. Eli nodded. Says she was doped out of her mind, didn't know what she was doing when she hacked them to pieces. And now she claims to be all sorrow and repentance over her action. Says she's... Eli finished his sentence. Given her life to God. I know. He croaked. I've been following her story. Conrad moved in to clarify. He means we've been following the story along with the rest of the nation. Eli continued. And now she's counseling with drug addicts, speaking to schools over the internet and... So what's your position? McFarland interrupted. About whether or not she should be executed. Suddenly Conrad saw it. McFarland was setting Eli up, putting him in a no-win situation. If Eli took the pro-death position, he'd be nullifying everything he said about God's mercy. If he took the anti-death position, he'd be nullifying everything he'd said about God's justice. McFarland had asked him the perfect lose-lose question. Once again, Conrad moved into the rescue. Listen, it's been a long day for Eli, maybe. So you're telling me you don't have a position? McFarland asked. Eli tried to answer, but again Conrad interrupted. I'm just saying he's tired and there might be a better time to... See what I mean? McFarland forced a grin. Your words are fine as long as they remain in theory and conjecture. As long as they remain high and lofty ideals. But when you get down to practical application, well, I'm afraid they really don't hold water, do they? They don't. The facts speak for themselves. If you went down to Texas, what would you do? Talk to Milka Toast, mercy, and forgiveness for the family of the boy this woman brutally butchered? Or do you tell her it's all the kids she's helped that God is... Excuse me. I think the pages are stuck together again. Excuse me. Alright. Or do you tell her and all the kids she's helped that God is a holy tyrant who demands justice and expects blood for blood? Eli paused a moment and began to nod. That's a good idea, Mr. McFarland. What? McFarland frowned. Well, what's a good idea? You're right, Eli croaked. I should talk to them, both of them. Eli! The protest came from Conrad before he could stop it. Eli turned to him. Your friend has a point. I'd be happy to meet with Eli and... Ellen. Didn't she email us? Well, yes, once, but... And the boy's family. I'd be happy to talk with them also if they'd let me. Now it was Conrad's turn to stand open-mouthed. Eli turned to McFarland. Can you help us set that up? Instinctively, McFarland glanced to Conrad, then back to Eli. This was too good to be true. Well, he cleared his throat. Certainly. He coughed again. Certainly, I could arrange that. That would be no problem at all. Eli smiled. Good. Then maybe you and Connie could work on the schedule. Conrad stared as McFarland tried unsuccessfully to hide the smile spreading across his face. And why not? He set the perfect trap and Eli had blindly strolled into it. No, he hadn't strolled in. He'd helped build it and purposely leaped through into it. A sinking feeling left Conrad's gut and spread through his limbs. I'd love to help, McFarland repeated, throwing another grin over at Conrad. Anything I can do to help clarify this matter, you can count on me. Julia did not relish heading down the paneled corridor to her father's office. It wasn't only because of the recurring dream. It was also because of the memories. Sweet and bitter, tender and horrible. Still, that was where he kept his filing cabinets, and that's where she might find something, anything, to better enable her to make the correct decision. Because, despite what she thought of his current situation, as his attorney, it was more important to know what he thought. If there was something he'd saved in a file, something to further define his understanding of living wills, or all that elusive phrase, heroic efforts, then it might help her better understand his wishes on the matter. At least that's what she told herself as she made her way down the hall. As she took hold of the metal knob, opened the door, and headed for the filing cabinets. But no matter how many files she reviewed, no matter how many she kept herself occupied flipping through them, she could not completely detach herself from this place or its past. It was nearly midnight when she pushed the last of the heavy drawers shut and leaned against the cabinets with a sigh. There had been nothing, just old articles, press releases, bios, contracts, and scripts from past segments. Nothing to shed any light on his feelings or her decision. She hesitated a moment before finally allowing herself to look around the room. So many memories. She glanced over at the trophies on the shelf under the window. There were several more since the last time she'd been there, but something other than the trophies caught her attention. Amidst all the dust and brass and plexiglass sat a yellowing baseball atop a child's teacup. She hadn't seen that ball in years, but recognized it immediately. Slowly, almost cautiously, she stepped toward it. She reached out and carefully took it into her hands. Daddy, what happened? What's going on? It's a home run, sweetheart. He grinned down at her as he clapped his hands with the other fans. He just hit a home run. Home run! She cried. A home run? Yes, he laughed at her excitement. Now he gets to run all around the bases and score a run. Lord have mercy on this book. The pages stay stuck together. A home run? Little Julia shouted. He hit a home run? Excitement overwhelmed her. She'd heard of home runs all her life, but now to actually see one. Tears sprang to her eyes as she began to cry. A home run! He hit a home run! Her father continued to laugh as he reached down to give her a hug. Are you okay? Yes! She cried, watching the runner in awe. Then turning to her mother, she shouted, Did you see it? He hit a home run! Yes, her mother grinned. I mean, just now, a real home run! Yes, her mother laughed as she glanced over to her father. I saw it! I saw it! Then suddenly, without a word, Dad turned and started to leave. Daddy? Daddy, where are you going? I'll be right back, he called as he stepped into the aisle and started up the concrete steps to the exit. Daddy! I'll be back in a minute. And he was. Well, actually several minutes. And when he returned, it was with a white, shiny baseball. What is it? She asked. It's the home run ball. I bought it off the guy who caught it. Her eyes widened in astonishment. Go ahead. Take it. At first, she was afraid to touch it. Go ahead, Jules. It's yours. She looked up nervously to him. He nodded. Then ever so slowly, almost reverently, she reached out. He placed it in her hands and she turned it over and over. Once again, tears leapt to her eyes. It was the home run ball. Her daddy had gone out and bought her back the home run baseball. The tears streamed down her cheeks. She was so overcome with joy, so overwhelmed by his love. She buried her face into his shirt and felt his big arms wrap around her. There was nothing this man wouldn't do for her. Nothing in the world. Julia stared at the old dusty ball for a long moment. What on earth was this doing with his awards? With the things that he'd fought and worked for his whole life? She glanced down at the faded teacup. A child's teacup from her old tea set. The toy tea set she and her father used to drink imaginary tea from. Right here. Right in the office. She glanced over at the desk. Right under that desk. Still holding the ball, she moved to the desk, pulled back the chair, and gently knelt down. The place underneath was impossibly small. It's a wonder they'd both been able to fit, but they had, on several occasions. Daddy, will we always be best friends? Yes, Jules, he had smiled. We'll always be best friends. And you'll never let anything bad happen to me? I'll never, ever let anything bad happen to you. She smiled. Good. And I'll never let anything bad happen to you. Good. He grinned. Then reaching out his hand the way she had taught him, with his little finger raised, he asked, Pinky swear? She giggled, delighted that he remembered, and reached out her own little finger to wrap it around his. Pinky swear. Julia took a deep breath and slowly rose from the desk. Pinky swear, she murmured almost distastefully, still holding the baseball. She walked around the desk and started for the door. Not once had she looked over at the leather couch, And not until this moment she paused to consider the destruction performed on it. Rachel Thomas was her name. Some student intern. At least that's the one little Julia had caught him with. The one her mother had shouted and screamed and wept over. The one who had destroyed their no. That wasn't right. The one he destroyed their family with. How many more had there been? She didn't know. 2, 3, a dozen? It didn't matter. Once a liar, always a liar. A man is as only good as his word. How many times had he told her that? Drilled it into her head. Made it her life's code. While all that time, he was carrying out his destructive lies right in their home. Right in their own room. Their room. A man is only as good as his word. How right he was. Arriving at the door, she turned back to the desk and tossed the ball onto it. It rolled across the papers, fell onto the floor, and disappeared into the shadows. It didn't matter where. She turned her back on the room, snapped off the light, and closed the door. She would not return. That was the end of chapter 8. How was that? Man, that part when she was reminiscing, thinking about the teacup, I could just imagine them sitting there together, and kind of, not gonna lie, it kind of got me in the feels. I was like, man, after all of that, he did something, and we found out what he did. It's crazy. Can't wait for chapter 9. Chapter 9 should be even awesomer. I'll catch you guys later. God bless you. Remember, Jesus loves you. Have a good night and a good day wherever you are.